Okay, we're continuing with our drama of my evolutionary story, my GRAIL quest. And as we were conversing about this in the pause, Valerie made a very good point, which was that as I was driving from this beautiful Crystal Hill farm in the country, and I was on my way into Buffalo to work at the family business every day for, 15 years or something. And so many times during that time, as I was driving, and there was one particular stretch of road actually, that I would be weeping, just tears coming down my, and it was not pain, it was bliss actually. I experienced it as bliss actually. But I remember that stretch of road. It was a beautiful country road, there were trees down both sides, and the sun was coming up over there. In fact, my hair is standing up right now just telling that story actually. I'm having bliss just remembering that story. And later, analyzing that, I believed that one of the byproducts of Kundalini, which is basically just intense plasma implosion, the plasma becoming more mindful, which is that the first thing you have to digest is every unshareable emotion of your life. So any pain that you stored instead of experienced has to be sorted. That's classic. They call it the collapse process, and collapse is a perfect description of plasma implosion. So yes, I was digesting every emotion and becoming a shareable wave in that time. But it was so fortunate because I was in a beautiful country in Eden, New York, and there was that beautiful country road. And I was in this rhythm, this discipline of working at the family electric business and learning lessons. So yeah, that was fortunate. But then the question we left this with that Lara asked before we took our break, which was, how did your quest then become international, so to speak, or how did you grow from there? And for me, it was because the family business, I had a little bit of resource that enabled me to travel, actually. And my first trip was, and my parents thought I was dead, actually. I went to Secrets of the Andes, Cusco, Puno, Juliaca, in the mountains of Peru.
And what motivated you to go there?
Because
you told me about a book that you read, or
the book was Secrets of the Andes by Brother Philip, which I later learned was the same author, Michael D. Abramovich, who wrote Secret Places of the Lion, which was about the reincarnational lineages that led from Pope Leo XIII and Brother Philip, and basically the Jesus GRAIL story, starting with the Syrian bloodline actually. And so that same author had written the book Secrets of the Andes, which talked about something called the Maxine light, which was a plasma sphere, a sacred crystal, so to speak, famous in the myths of the ancient Andes, which I later learned was connected to the Viracocha Quetzalcoatl stories. Viracocha, I think, was called Viracena in Spanish, which Vincent Bridges later referred to. And that story, I didn't know it then, but relates directly to what Edgar Cayce called the Tuoi stone fire crystal, what in Lord of the Ring was called Silmarillion, the fire crystal, the sacred stone, Anton Parks later called Girku, which was this fire crystal.
Okay, and this book was about this crystal?
The Maxine light, absolutely, yes.
And you were interested in the book? How did you get this interest in
I
the
was
book?
there looking for the lost library of the Andes. And actually what happened is I ended up with a group of Swiss medical missionaries who knew the Abramovich and where the story came from, which is a place called, actually I can tell you the secret, it's called San Juan del Oro, St. John of the Sun. And there's a mountain there, it's actually a mountainside. And I stayed in a cave in that mountain. And I don't know how to put it, but that's the first time in my life I heard a mountain speak to me, but I did. That mountain spoke to me. I heard the words, actually. That was plasma intelligence for sure.
And was this in Peru?
This was in Peru.
Okay.
That was during that trip, yeah. And I ended up in an isolated valley with, they called me Maestro, which I don't know why they called me Maestro, but they did. And I had adventures in the Andes, actually. That's the point at which my parents hadn't heard from me in months, and they thought I might be dead, actually, at that point in the Andes.
And so you read the book and you went on this journey to Peru and you stopped at all these places that you read about in the book and were experiencing what you know, just how you feel this place.
Well, at the time, if you had asked me, I would have said, I'm looking for the lost monastery in the Andes, which has this magic light. Okay. But now, in retrospect, I know more. The magic light is the place of plasma convergence, where the plasma becomes most self-aware. That's what that stone is about. It isn't about the stone itself, but it's about the plasma field that can grow around the stone, which is then mindful, quite literally, that charged bubble, as it were, which is what all these fire crystal stories. And later, with Louis Acker, who's famous in his own right, we actually had a meeting of piezo crystallographers in Western New York on the physics of the Atlantean fire crystal. But that's later in the story. Yeah. But so I went for the...
And so this was your experience in Peru?
Yeah.
And after Peru, you went back to
for
New York?
Yeah, and then somehow I decided I had money left, and I went very shortly thereafter to Giza, to the pyramids. Actually.
In Egypt?
Yeah. And I had adventures. Again, there was a famous professor, I think his name was Dan Baer, and we met miraculously in the garden outside the pyramids. And I think first I went into the king's chamber, and for some reason I was there alone, and the lights went out just as I laid down in the sarcophagus. Actually, true story. And I felt that icy coldness, and I felt the ability to project plasma. Well, I wouldn't have called it plasma at the time, but I felt the ability to project into stars at that moment. I felt how those... Like,
what do you mean by project into stars?
Well, subsequently, I learned about the tubes aligning to Sirius and Orion that point accurately from the pyramid. But at that time, I wasn't conscious of how directly the squirt gun was aimed. But I felt how you could direct your...
communicate?
Yeah. And you could feel the... But now I can feel that so intensely that it makes that seem trivial by comparison. Because now I can feel that, like a lightning bolt, quite literally. But at that time, it was the first experience of that, in the sarcophagus, the king's chamber. And also then, as I mentioned, I've told others, but I was in the gold sarcophagus in the Museum of Cairo of Tutankhamun, and I passed out. I swooned. I had an intense moment there.
And
later.
Would you call that also a bliss experience, or?
I don't know what I'd call it. Actually, when you overwhelmed with memory, maybe, and subsequently I learned a bunch of connections there that and this is sort of after the fact, but Out of Egypt, House of the Messiah, this whole body of literature that explains in detail how the Essene Christian is directly the bloodline of Pharaoh, Akhenaten, Moses, and who's called the righteous priest. So Tutankhamun, Akhenaten become Moses, Aaron, and so the whole royal line of the Essenes is the royal line of Egypt. So when you're in Tutankhamun's tomb, and you realize his bloodline was named Thutmose, which means sons of Thoth, which is Tahuti, which is Enki's partner. So all of that I realized later.
So maybe all this knowledge came in one moment, like...
Yeah, that's exactly
and then
right. Yes.
Error.
Yes, and then later you learn from, again, secret places of the lion, that the bloodline that was Tutankhamun was a Syrian genetic experiment. And you learn the Syrians are was behind Enki's mother, who made the suggestions for the cloning operations that resulted in that bloodline called Thutmose, the name for the royal line of Egypt, which is also, later you find out in the last movie we made together, that Thoth is literally the grandfather of Magdalene, the Black Madonna.
And this knowledge you read also in a book, or what made you go to Egypt? Was it also something you read or something you heard here, or? I was friends with... It's funny because I landed in Athens, and at that time you could not fly from Cairo to Jerusalem. So I took a plane down from Athens, which is the roughest, most nauseating airline flight of my life, Athens to Cairo.
And then I flew to Tel Aviv, and I knew unconsciously, for some reason my inner voice wouldn't let me go into Jerusalem, but I went to the Sea of Galilee, and I had these intense, really, absolute meltdown, melt your chakras down, Kundalini experiences for about a week on the Sea of Galilee, actually. And so it isn't like saying, well, I'm a reincarnation of, well, there's a fragment of the memory of the Tutankhamun line, but the real meaning of that memory line is the plasma lightning itself. That's what the memory line is. And
but I guess in this area there is a lot of energy going on with the pyramids, and there is a lot of history. So
that's right, and some of that history, the pieces. Like, for example, I think it was at that time that I realized why, when I was a little boy, and Superman would break out this crystal on his ring, and his power crystal would be the moment when Superman saves the day. But every time Superman got out the crystal on his ring on television, I had to go hide. I was like, I was a little kid, but I couldn't bear to watch Superman using his crystal when I was a kid, actually.
And
True story.
Why is that?
Well, because the Atlanteans, which was named Thule, which is named for Thoth, misused that crystal.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
They enslaved thousands of people, and they tipped over half a continent, and they messed it up.
So you had all this knowledge already when you were a child?
Well, I had
unconsciously.
That's right, unconsciously.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And then during this travels to Peru and Egypt and your study background and the Gurdjieff school,
the pieces started. It only started to come together. And for example, it was at that time that I had flashbacks. I don't know how it started, but I had memory flashbacks of the royalty of Egypt using Tutankhamun's body to control the weather, the rain. That's a weird memory, but I had that memory actually at the time. And later I discovered I was a rainmaker. I studied how Rolling Thunder did it. He tickled the belly of the black beetle, which I later learned was fractal electrically. And so I was traveling with Vincent Bridges, and we were regularly calling storms the size of continents, actually. And we wrote that up on goldenmean.info/rain, and our rainmaking curriculum is taught.
So you already had your own business then when you did this travels?
Well, remember, so most of these travels are while I'm working at the family business, and my father, who owned the family business, was generous to me. So it meant I could, you want a couple weeks off to,
Yeah, okay.
So I was very fortunate. I had a supportive family. It's not that my family believed in what I was doing. They just set me free.
Yeah.
And that was a blessing, a major blessing. Although years later, I recognized that my views of Magdalene were upset my mother on occasion. I think, actually. I can understand now. But
because they were Catholic?
Yes. Yeah, rather conventional. But so I was fortunate and free and had some resource. When I got into Cairo, I was going to check into this little hotel, and they said, "Oh, you have the American Express card," and I was only 27 years old, but I was not rich, but I was lucky.
Yeah.
And able to travel. Yeah.
And this experience during these travels, they brought you back to New York and make you think about new...
Well, then, I think my next major trip was Findhorn, actually.
Okay, so you were not done with your mystic travel.
That's what led me to community, really, and we started a community in Western New York, and we started a community in North Carolina, and I had friends at Findhorn, and it was a beautiful thing. I was grateful. So going back and forth, and then what happened was I owned this farm, Crystal Hill Farm, which Valerie has seen. It's a beautiful farm on the hill with a view of the lake. In fact, I put a picture window in the barn loft where we had 300 Sufis doing Bliss dance, and through the picture window in the barn loft with a cathedral wooden ceiling, you could see the lake. And the wind generator's over there, and there's 3 wells in a pond, and and the labyrinth's over here, and this heirloom seeds garden is over here. It was fun.
That sounds like heaven.
Well, and my father bought me all the toys. I had the electric tractors over here, and the electric van is over here, and the 10,000 watt Millville wind generators up there, and you know, and I had 17 wires going out to pumps and 4 wells in a pond, and I stuck the new 7-fold flow form spa right next to the greenhouse.
So it was already a kind of a community there.
No, but we, you know, 7 bedrooms, and you know, I was trouble, so of course we made trouble. No, it was, you know, those were the days. Legend in his own mind, I guess. Just to complete the story, so 300 people spent several days there at the auction just to sell the stuff before I left the farm. I had 3 tractors, and, you know, it was archetype. But see, that's what happened. We actually just summarize in terms of sequence of events. So I met Hans Keller, who from the South American Conference on Climate, a very famous guy, who was wishing to recover a property that he lost in North Carolina, which later became Circle of Life, our community, Waynesville, North Carolina, now called the Biodome Community, because the geodesic dome there, designed by Bucky Fuller, whom I spent time with in University of Detroit, because I joined the architecture school when he was there and carried the geodesic. So Bucky designed the geodesic dome at Biodome, and John Denver installed it, actually. And that was a gorgeous community experiment, Circle of Life, in North Carolina. And I was the co-founder, so yeah.
So, and this was after you came back from Findhorn?
Yeah, well, so I had continued the family business for years and was successful and did all these things. And then I decided, actually I was joined by Gamati, Pam, who was a wonderful partner at that time, and who had experience in community building. And she helped me start this community in North Carolina. She became the counselor. We were, you know, close, but we weren't actually a couple per se. And she later started it was called the Ashea Meditation Society, who came from Bali to buy the community from us in North Carolina after a whole book full of drama, which involved the fact that we started a holistic health center. I bought the live blood cell microscope, and we had the most famous holistic physician in the USA, Lee Cowden, was our medical director. And our function there was, we were saving the lives of women dying from silicone breast implant, mostly. That's what we did. And we did it by ozone colema enemas and cleansing. It was beautiful and powerful. And it's very interesting. One of the lessons I learned about community there, just to say briefly, you know, the old saying, well, if you do everything by consensus process, then it's going to take 6 days to decide on the color of the toilet paper. Well, that's one of the things we did wrong. But it was a beautiful experiment. But the other thing we did wrong is we attracted too many young people with fabulous energy. We built that community. I mean, the upper building, we had 12 suite bedrooms. We built it by hand. It was gorgeous. Later it burned down, but it's another story. But the thing is, we should have had a core group that had the main group grow more. So the main group can grow fast, but there needs to be a core group to steer. Yeah. But the other major thing that happened, I can tell you, is we had these women, many of whom had past life Indians as Cherokee, as natives. And they were coming there, these women were coming there to die, actually. The young people who were caring for these women with silicone poisoning were wonderful in that the women loved them, but the young people were too traumatized by seeing people dying, basically. They couldn't handle that.
So there were people dying in the community?
There were a few, I think, that indirectly.
Okay.
Yeah. And silicone breast implant poisoning will do that. And Lee Cowden's technique of the ozone colema was capable of saving many of them, but not all of them. And so, as a result, the clash between the young people and the older people became serious. And in the end, the community lost the economics, truly. And it was messy, honestly. And I had the live blood cell microscopy equipment, and many things happened. Actually, the next part of this story leads me to how I became set up to design what became the Media Lab at Gaia TV, because Jirka there, who was the owner of Corporate Express and then Gaia TV, Transicon, was friends with Drunvalo, and Drunvalo had Jirka fly to our community in North Carolina and offered me the position of the media director, basically, of the installing and designing the Media Lab.
Well, that's a totally different thing.
For Gaia Television. Well, just to say that how I came to know Drunvalo and Greg Braden, this becomes our personal story. You know, the meetings with remarkable men part of the story is that how did that happen? I guess I was living in Boulder when I met Greg Braden, who came to what was then Drunvalo's older home. I think what it was that in my trips back and across the USA, I stayed. Drunvalo actually invited me to stay at his cabin there when he was first doing the drawings that became Flower of Life. Actually, and we were buddies. And then Greg Braden bought his old place, and Greg Braden and I had adventures getting stuck in the wilderness in my giant Ford Expedition. And we said, oh, we can cross that river with this big old truck. It costs $50,000. We should be able to cross this river. Well, no. That's another long dramatic. But the point is I came to know those guys, and Flower of Life eventually then did sponsor my first 3 or 4 world tours, actually, teaching sacred geometry.
So you got into sacred geometry in your connection with Drunvalo, or?
Well, see, if you're seeing immense patterns of light in your Kundalini psyche, you need to sort them out, obviously. So actually the sequence of events is more like Jirka knew that I was a computer animator. I was a nerd, and he needed that to make educational films about spiritual science.
Okay.
And
so he picked you for this knowledge.
Right. Well, that's one of the reasons. I'm not sure why really, but Jirka was on the cover of like 3. Jirka Reisevi was on the cover of 3 international business magazines the week that he hired me, basically. And it was a dramatic story. And Jay Widener was his esoteric advisor, who later I introduced to Vincent Bridges, who then wrote Monument to the End of Time, Cross of Henday together as a result of my having introduced them in part. And I had many adventures actually there. But the sequence was that Jirka paid for the software systems, which today you would call it Final Cut on an Apple Mac. But in those days, to do what Final Cut can do on a portable computer, it costs about $3 to $10 million to do what Final Cut can do today. Yeah. But Jirka had $3 to $10 million, so he bought this Avid video suite and sent us to training. And he bought me the fanciest software, electric image, and everything I needed to do wonderful animations, including the GRAIL animation. I started with equations, but then I assembled in a Macromind Director, which I learned directly from Bruce Lipton.
So, but actually, then this is the first time that you had a job where you could do this spiritual practices as well as your technological knowledge.
Well, I was living in the mountains above Boulder. My best friend Russell Wright was there, and he became the Avid video operator. And I was privileged in that we used to joke that we had all the toys that CNN could not afford. And it was actually true. At that time, I think we had more 3/4-inch beta digital video decks than CNN, actually. And so I had equipment, I had training, I had software, I had a beautiful space to work, and I was set free.
Yeah.
And my boss at the time, Rick Hasson, was like co-producer of the movie Stargate, which used the Ophanim-Enochian alphabet. You know, I was like in a witch's brew of creative stuff.
Yeah.
And very fortunate.
And a lot of inspiring people. And is this also the place where you meet the most of the remarkable
Well, yeah, the meetings with remarkable men part of the story. There's many pieces of that, but one piece of that is the fact that Jirka decided that the first things he was going to do was make like professional films just for practice with the most famous consciousness scientists on the planet. So when Robert Lawler came to town, he stayed in my apartment in Boulder. You know, wrote the original of sacred geometry books. And we had Hancock, Bouval, Temple, The Serious Mystery. All those people were staying with us. I mean, we knew all those people. So that was...
So, but they also count you as a conscious scientist.
Well, actually, my function there was very specific. I was the media nerd. And, you know, we had meetings every day with like Jay, who, you know, Jay Widener now, he's very famous. He had every esoteric story on the block. He had been interviewed on what's that famous radio show more times than anybody else, and had his own esoteric radio show. So if you wanted the spiritual gossip, and I remember the first time I ever made a video and a geometric graphic of the golden spiral on the Orion star map on the Giza plateau. You know, Jay Widener was standing over my shoulder saying, well, this has got to go there.
So, but that's the Egyptian journey.
Yeah, well, you see, so there I was working at what became Gaia TV. At that time it was called Gaiam Transicon.
So that was also one of the reasons you went to Egypt then?
Well, no, I was back from Egypt, and I was now making educational media about what I learned. That's more like it, really. And so I became... Well, what happened next is Drunvalo was also the main support person for Flower of Life, Drunvalo, and bought the Cave Creek Research Facility. And so Drunvalo invited me to teach at the International Flower of Life Facilitators Conference in Cave Creek. And this is sort of the next step here. That day, I had invitations to speak in something like 7 or 8 different countries that day. So I went to give a talk at his Flower of Life because he was friends with Drunvalo, and suddenly I had invitations to teach all over the world. And I was like, well, this might be fun. And I came to know also Flower of Life there, Ron Holt and Lisa Royale, who wrote Prism of Lyra, and Ron Holt ran Flower of Life for years, and they were friends. And I had lunch with them, you know, often in Phoenix. And so when she was writing the Prism of Lyra, which today we know from Elena Danaan is where the humanoids came in the galactic diaspora, and I was with them at that time. And so both Drunvalo and Ron Holt, the Flower of Life, they co-sponsored my first tour of Australia, for example. And I was invited to the big International Nexus Conference in Sydney, and that was my first of many, maybe 20 tours of Australia, actually.
And did you teach for Drunvalo, or did you teach your own discoveries?
No, I taught, at the time it was called Sacred Geometry and the Physics of Consciousness, actually. I'll give you an example of what I was teaching. At that time, Drunvalo was teaching that if you visualize 2 oppositely rotating concentric interdigitated tetrahedron, 2 tetra make a cube, if they're spinning in opposite directions, and you have that visualization, your 2 knees and your head and your tailbone, that's 1 tetra, and the other tetra is a point in front and 2 points behind here, and the crown. So you've got 2 tetrahedron, 180 degrees out of phase, spinning. Essentially, all you're doing is visualizing a spinning cube around your body. And that was called the tetrahedral, the Flower of Life meditation. And the fact is that there were a certain sequence of those visualizations, and that visualization is useful and powerful. However, what we learned after studying the astral hygiene, people having problem with astral parasites and things, that the last step, which Drunvalo always said was dangerous and kind of a quote-unquote secret, that if you didn't do the last step, you were more susceptible to the astral hygiene problems. And the secret of that last step, which is so powerful, is the fact that when you're finished visualizing a tetra cube, literally a diamond, your diamond light,
the Merkaba, right?
The Merkaba, exactly. Yeah. goldenmean.info/Merkaba, the holographics. When you're finished visualizing a tetra cube around your body, you have created what is effectively a hex snowflake, which is crystallizing and stabilizing and organizing and useful, but that if you don't do the last step, then you're more susceptible to parasites because, and that's what requires a little explanation. If you take that tetracube, and we'll do this in the visuals with the film here, but if you take that tetracube and you tilt it at 32 degrees, which is the chin angle of the Sphinx, and rotate that cube and blink 5 times, now you have a pentodeca. So you've embedded a cube in a pentadecahedron. And now you're visualizing pent and not hex. And Drunvalo was right to say, well, that could be dangerous because if you're not ready to implode, you're going to get dizzy. But if you don't do that, unfortunately, you're more susceptible to parasites because it's implosion that does the sorting.
Yeah.
So I did probably, 10 or 20 tours of the world actually doing these lectures. And I developed the biggest repertoire of sacred geometry animations on the planet, which are still, and lots of people use them, and that's okay. So, but that was an example of a core concept that we evolved to understand the solution to astral hygiene actually is implosion. And the hex is the beginning, but not the climax of.
Yeah.
The pent is the climax of, which is basically golden ratio, which is literally, if you revolve that into 3D, that's called the Holy Grail. And that's our logo animation here. So, the logo here is the Grail quest for the real physics of consciousness. And you see how we're getting close to that, which is good. So the next part of this story would be some of the actual remarkable men.